When you start looking at reactive architecture, you'll often come across the term domain-driven design, which refers to an architectural approach that is used to design large systems. Now, the guidelines or the rules that are set out by domain-driven design are actually highly compatible with those of reactive architecture. As it turns out, many of the goals of the two are very similar. They're very compatible. And so as a result, you'll often see them used together. Now, domain-driven design originates from a book called Domain-Driven Design, Tackling Complexity in the Heart of Software. That was written by Eric Evans. The goal, one of the key goals in the book, is to try to create a software implementation that is based on an evolving model that is understood by the domain experts. So it's largely about creating a communication channel, you could say, between the domain experts and the software developers. We'll talk more about that in later videos in the course. Now, as far as goals go, domain-driven design, one of the key goals within it is to take a large system, or a large domain rather, and to break it into smaller and smaller pieces. The problem that we have with large domains is that they can be very hard to model. There's a lot of rules, a lot of different things that we have to keep in mind when we're trying to model a large domain. And trying to do that all in one single coherent model can be very difficult or impossible in many cases. So because of that, we try to break things down into smaller pieces. This gives us a way to determine boundaries essentially between those smaller pieces within the larger domain. Microservices, reactive microservices specifically, have a similar goal. They need to be separated along clear boundaries, and in the case of reactive microservices, those boundaries need to be asynchronous. Each microservice has to have a clearly defined API and a specific set of responsibilities. If we don't know what the responsibilities of the microservice are, then it's going to be very hard to build it and design it properly. The trick comes when we try to determine what those boundaries are. There's no clearly defined technique that will just give us the right answer all of the time. However, this is where domain-driven design can help us. It does give us a set of guidelines and a set of techniques that we can use to try to help us break larger domains into smaller domains. And because of that, we can take that logic and apply it to microservices to come out with something similar. Now, if you look at reactive frameworks such as Logem, for example, Logem is built with domain-driven design in mind, and it leverages some of its terminology. If you look, for example, it has the concept of a persistent entity in Logem. That maps directly onto the concept of an entity, which comes from domain-driven design. And again, we'll talk more about that a little later in the course. The key here that we need to realize is that domain-driven design can be used in the absence of a reactive microservice or a reactive architecture, and you can build reactive architectures without domain-driven design. But because the two are very compatible and they do have similar goals, you'll often find them used together. And we are going to continue to do that in this course.